France's use of the guillotine was something of a spectator sport. In France, the guillotine was like the Macy's Day Parade, a Super Bowl tailgate party, and the part in Frankenstein with the villagers chasing Frankenstein's monster with torches and pitchforks. Back then, Parisians lived for this kind of thing. Today we're going to learn about what it was like during the guillotine era in France. But before we get started, subscribe to our channel, Wanda Discoveries, leave a comment, and let us know what bizarre and weird historical items you would like to hear about. Now, it must be noted that while France kept the guillotine up until the late 1970s, September 10th, 1977 to be exact, public executions ended 38 years earlier, on June 17, 1939, when Eugene Weidmann was sentenced for the conviction of 6 murders. While Weidmann was being led up to the guillotine and assumed the position, the crowd of rowdy Parisians cheered, yelled, and basically enjoyed themselves way too much. Someone in the crowd even secretly filmed the whole thing, and that's when the French government put an end to the viewing parties. After Weidmann, all of France's guillotine activity took place in private, in the prison courtyard. This solved 2 problems. 1, the executioners could rely on a working guillotine with every use. French prison employees would have to build and tear down their guillotine, like overworked carnies at the county fair. Because of this, it wasn't uncommon for the guillotine to malfunction every now and then. It wasn't unheard of for a trigger to snap apart or an unaligned blade to produce a sloppy severing. A permanent guillotine could be regularly maintained and calibrated, making the act a bit more predictable, if not much more efficient. The other problem it served, the crowds were getting wild in the streets. Local bars filled up with spectators pre-gaming before the heading. Building owners with views looking out onto the action sold window seats to those who wanted a bird's-eye view of the proceedings. Kids would be hanging off nearby tree branches in hopes of getting a glimpse. The French government, along with prison employees, realized the guillotine had officially become bigger and much more of a headache, yes, pun intended, than they ever estimated. How did the public find out? Notices were posted around town announcing the time and place. Sometimes the prison would give their version of a press release to the local newspaper with the scheduling information, and sometimes the times weren't announced, and crowds would just gather around prison employees assembling a guillotine in the middle of a road. By the late 1930s, guillotine fans earned a violent reputation, much like football hooligans. The prison staff would be forced to assemble their guillotine in the middle of the night, then do the deed early in the morning in the hopes of avoiding bloodthirsty crowds. But it never worked. The guillotine always drew a big crowd. The guillotine is pretty menacing looking. You have to remember the device was a relatively new invention, so it looked unusual. It was designed to be swift, clean, and humane. Its angled metal blade rested high above the crowd for maximum visibility. It was an intimidating beast. It was all lean, no filler. The machine's simple design was made up of one very tall, narrow wooden rectangle, sort of like a window frame, except instead of a sliding window pane, it had a large weighted steel blade, which in theory would make a clean cut. The head would gently fall into a woven basket filled with sawdust. The sawdust was there to soak up anything. The rest was rolled into a cheap coffin. The efficiency was almost as scary as the mechanism itself. One of the first things you saw was a procession of rickety wooden carts hauling the convicts to the guillotine. During the French Revolution, the guillotine was so refined it could take care of 12 people every 13 minutes. Those carts were always busy. Over time, the guillotine's efficiency improved, primarily due to the efforts of Charles-Henri, the royal executioner of France during the reign of King Louis XVI, who personally tested the machine on animals and cadavers. Sanson had tested the guillotine for the first time in public on Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. The precision with which Pelletier's dome had separated from his former self pleased Sanson, and the guillotine's use spread. Eventually, the sight of watching French soldiers, called gendarmes, lead these carts around the city filled with convicted criminals was the signal that the guillotine would soon be following. One eyewitness said, "The same carts as those that are used in Paris for carrying wood, 4 boards were placed across them for seats, and on each board sat 2 and sometimes 3 victims. Their hands were tied behind their back, and the constant jolting of the cart made them nod their heads up and down to the great amusement of the spectators." The crowds that gathered around the guillotine weren't always rowdy, quite the opposite. It was common for groups of attending women to knit and converse while gathered around the guillotine, called tricotieuses. These women initially gathered for local government debates, but officials eventually banned the ladies from public assemblies. So they turned to guillotines for the entertainment factor instead. They even crafted small items in honor of the day's events, including Phrygian caps. Despite their domestic origins, the women became associated with bloodlust and anger as the French Revolution progressed. Tricoteuses reportedly developed a violent and hateful reputation. The executioner was always the star of the show. He was the guy onlookers focused on, whether they saw him as a hero or the heel. They knew the headsman was in charge. He was the star point guard, and because the guillotine offered a figuratively hands-off approach to capital punishment, executioners didn't even particularly feel guilty for ending another man's life. Executioners focused on the machine itself rather than what the machine was doing to a fellow human being. They also prepped the guillotine and cleaned up after the event. How's that for humility? Oddly enough, Parisians thought the speed of execution via guillotine removed some of the religious and social connections between death and execution, lessening the spectacle's emotional aspect. The public initially criticized the guillotine for being too easy and clinical. During the use of the guillotine, crowds reportedly yelled, "Give me back my wooden gallows." Not always, but sometimes, depending on how many of the condemned were on the day's docket. A person who was about to take the guillotine's angled blade was given the opportunity to say a few last words. Many guillotine victims, but not all, had their last words recorded for posterity. Before his execution in 1793, King Louis XVI gave a speech to the crowd telling them, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Officials expected the condemned to remain stalwart in the face of death, but not all abided by this. Louis XIV's mistress, Madame du Barry, begged the crowd and perhaps her executioner to give her one more moment. Marie Antoinette, by some accounts, uttered her final words as an apology to her executioner for having stepped on his foot. While the invention of the guillotine was supposedly more humane and less bloody than other methods, crowds still attended expecting to see gore. They weren't all showy, but there were some executioners who really liked to feed into the crowd's need for blood and gore. These particular executioners often triumphantly held up the head of the recently chopped for the masses to see. When Charlotte Corday died via guillotine in 1793, the executioner held up her head and slapped her cheeks, reportedly making her face blush. A spectator wrote about this incident, noting that the eyes seemed to retain speculation for a moment or two, and there was a look in the ghastly stare with which they stared upon the crowd, which implied that the head was aware of the ignominious situation. The amount of gore on guillotines caused horrible odors, prompting the residents within its proximity to complain. Sometimes the condemned prisoner's blood became cherished, such as when crowds rushed to dip their handkerchiefs in the sanguine mess left by King Louis XVI. The guillotine may have changed the spectacle of death, but it didn't eliminate it. How do you think you'd react to the scene at a guillotine if you were the average Parisian? There's a good chance you might faint or vomit. Albert Camus wrote about his father's experience witnessing the guillotine, something that caused the man to throw up and never speak of the event again. According to Albert's reflections on the guillotine, written in 1957, his father watched as a convicted murderer in Algiers died via guillotine during World War I. "My father wanted to attend an execution. He got up while it was still dark, for the place where the guillotine was set up was at the other end of the city, and once there, found himself among a great crowd of spectators. He never told us what he saw that morning. My mother could only report that he rushed wildly into the house, refused to speak, threw himself on the bed, and suddenly began to vomit." So what do you think? Was the guillotine humane? Let us know below and check out some of these other videos from Wanda Discoveries.